Thank you for joining me on this edition of Blister Prevention Office Hours. We're going to be looking at the 4 problems that I see that are limiting the advancement of foot friction blister management. The first one is the word friction. Now, you know you're off to a bad start when there's a problem with the word that's in the name of the thing, friction blisters, and in the mainstream understanding of what causes blisters, which is heat, moisture, and friction. And the specific problem is that friction it has 2, not just different meanings, but opposite meanings, and that's a problem. So it means both rubbing and the resistance to rubbing. Now, when we use the wrong lay definition of friction, which is rubbing, it makes us think, it gives us certain misconceptions, and they are, the most common ones are that blisters are a superficial to deep wear injury. In fact, that describes an abrasion. A blister is an intraepidermal tear. It's a mechanical fatigue under the skin surface. Certainly not a superficial to deep wear injury. It makes people think that blisters are a thermal burn, in that things rub so much that it gets hot enough that we get a burn, a thermal burn or burn blister. But research shows that it just doesn't get hot enough, even on a hot day, even when we're exercising. It makes us think that calluses are a good prevention, because you will literally have to wear through thicker or more layers of corneum before you get to the raw skin, but that's just not how blisters work. I'm sure we've all seen blisters underneath a callus. Calluses are certainly not protective, and it makes people think, and even podiatrists, especially me, like 15, 20 years ago, think that taping was the frontline prevention, because we're eliminating the rubbing, and therefore we're doing all we need to do in terms of blister prevention. But I hope to show you that that's not necessarily the case. What we need to do is use the more scientific definition of friction, and that is the force that resists the movement between 2 surfaces. Friction in this simplified diagram here on the right is the red arrow. Now, what we've got here, the simplified diagram just shows a bone. Let's say it's a metatarsal head. It's moving in one direction. Friction is the force at the skin surface keeping it stationary. So the bones move back and forth in the foot with every step that we take, and the skin doesn't move in perfect sync with it, at least not to start with. So the result is this soft tissue sandwich between skin and bone takes up, because it's a viscoelastic, it undergoes shear, essentially. It deforms, it distorts, it's undergoing shear to make up for this mismatch of movement. That's the role of friction. Friction is not the movement. If the force of this bone movement was to overcome friction force, the skin surface would move in the same direction as the bone. So it would go like this. Yeah. All the while, the friction force is acting in the opposite direction, but it's not the actual movement. So friction force, you can think of it like when you walk up to a brick wall and you push on it, you exert a force to the wall's exerting one back, but nothing material happens. Like the wall doesn't fall over. It's a bit like that with friction force. It's a force of resistance. So I find it helpful just to get you really clear on what shear looks and feels like. So if you just get your fingertip and pop it on the back of your other hand, if you keep it stuck to that same bit of skin and move it back and forth, that looks a lot like rubbing, but there's actually no relative movement between this and this, okay, because it's stuck to the same bit of skin. What's keeping it stuck to the same bit of skin? Friction force, okay? And then if we move the hand, if this is the foot, it would be, the foot moving like that. So what's not happening is rubbing, but all of this soft tissue here is stretching and distorting, and that's what shear is, and that is what causes friction blisters. So friction blisters are 100% caused by repetitive shear deformation. This is nothing new. We've known this for a long time. It's bone movement in the presence of high friction force, keeping the skin surface stationary, and everything in between stretching and distorting. As I said, we've known this for many years. We've got the original experimental blister research from Naylor and Salzberger in 55 and 66. And then Stanley Kameish from, I think he was in the British military, he took a more engineering perspective to this injury and tried to figure out whether it was a superficial to deep wear injury, whether it was caused by heat, enzymes, pressure, stretching, ischemia, or fatigue. And Kamesh found that it was definitely the fatigue that was the result of the repetitive shear deformation. And he mentioned that there may be some involvement with increased skin temperature. Now, further experimental research by Farina Hashmi and colleagues in the UK in 2013 found that it wasn't the increased temperature wasn't caused by the frictional rubbing on the skin. It was more of a result. So it wasn't causative, it was the result of the injury. So heat is not overly involved in the cause of friction blisters, not in terms of, you know, rubbing two sticks together and making a fire type thing. So that's the first problem, is we're getting off on the wrong foot with the understanding of friction. Concerningly, these misconceptions are perpetuated in the academic literature, and I mean, I don't even need to tell you that it's perpetuated in the non-academic literature and from shoe stores and just conversations between athletes and people in general. And I've got 3 examples. So Krabik, Waite and Lippmann, these are the guys that did the paper tape study. They talk about blisters as if it is a superficial to deep wear injury or an abrasion. They say that they're caused by the skin rubbing against another surface, causing exfoliation of the stratum corneum. That is not the case. That is what describes an abrasion, and an abrasion and a blister are completely different injuries. And that was in 2013. 2014, Joseph Knapik from the American military said foot blisters are caused by boots rubbing on the foot. Now, it might sound like I'm being a bit nitpicky, but things are in a bit of a mess with our understanding of friction blisters, and it pays to be very specific about what we're saying. At least in a military situation, it's actually impossible for the boot to rub the foot because you've got the sock in the way. So what's the role there? What's rubbing what and what's not rubbing what? So there is no rubbing. We do not need rubbing on the skin to cause blisters, and it's certainly not the shoe rubbing on the foot, unless potentially we're talking about triathlon and sort of fashion situations where people don't want to wear socks or stockings. Then perhaps, but again, you don't even need the rubbing part, it's the shear part, and I'm going to elaborate on that a bit more in a minute. Dubois in 2022, looking at the skin sock frictional interface, says that blisters are a result of abrasion caused by frictional forces applied directly to the skin's top layer of the epidermis, the stratum corneum. Again, that is an abrasion, not a blister. So you can see that, you know, even in current day, like more recent literature, there's just these misunderstandings that are perpetuated. What I've found is, because I've got about 4 lever arch files of blister research at home, and what I kind of have found is around the 1990s and early 2000s is when things started to change. So like we've known about blisters being caused by repetitive shear deformation right back from 55, 66 and 73. And these researchers were talking about friction, rubbing and shear in the correct way. Around about the 90s and early 2000s, I've noticed this shift where we're getting things wrong. We're talking about friction in terms of rubbing. And so it's almost like this weird situation where our understanding is going backwards rather than forwards. Yeah, it's not an ideal situation. We also have a third problem, which is we can't measure shear. Now, we can measure shear for the whole plantar surface, but that's not particularly helpful because we want to know discrete anatomical locations. It's like, and we can measure that shear for the whole plantar surface with pressure plates. So if you think about pressure, we have the nice little, you know, the red bits and the yellow bits to denote how high shear pressure is, and you can have the little sort of bar bits that depict it really nicely. That's helpful in terms of pressure. And if only we had the same thing for shear, but we just don't have it. So it would be like trying to understand something in terms of pressure and normal force. And for the plantar surface, not having that peak pressure information for all the little sort of centimetre squares, instead just for the whole plantar surface as a whole at one moment in time. So you could imagine that if we don't really know, if we can't measure it, it's kind of hard to then advance our understanding, spread that message, etc. Suffice to say that shear happens with every step that we take within our foot, and that is because our foot approaches the ground at an angle and leaves the ground at an angle. And so the bones move, the skin, because of high friction force, doesn't move, and we get this shear deformation. It happens on the plantar surface, but it also happens at the back of the heel. It happens interdigitally. It happens on the dorsum of the toes. It would be really helpful if we had a way to measure that. But as far as my understanding goes, there is nothing imminent in that way. And the last problem is we have a limited evidence base. Now, I think it was last month I did a whole office hours episode on this, so I won't spend too much time because I could literally do another 40 minutes on this. Suffice to say that we have some evidence for a few things: familiarity with footwear, familiarity with the activity. Densely padded acrylic socks are better than densely padded cotton socks. That's the work of Herring and Ritchie in the 1990s. And we know that 3mm neoprene or Spenco insoles provide some prevention power. We have evidence that shows that antiperspirants don't work in nor do powders, and we have equivocal evidence for paper tape. We've got one study that either way. One shows it makes it worse. One study with a bit of a redesign showed that it helped a lot just for paper tape. And we have equivocal evidence for double socks. From memory, there are 3 studies. They use different socks, different constructions, padding, different blends, different fibres. So the results are really hard to hang your hat on any specific way as to whether it works or whether it doesn't. And then we have a whole list of preventions that are in popular use that have not been put to the test. They include lubricants. There are 100 blister lubricants out there on the market. They haven't been put to the test in terms of blister prevention. Tapes that we use as podiatrists, so fixable, rigid sports tape, kinesio tape, haven't been put to the test. Pressure deflective padding even hasn't been put to the test, known as donut pads in the blister space. Optimized shoe fit even hasn't been tested. So there's a whole bunch of things here. Now, we do have a bit of lab research for some of these, most notably moisture wicking socks. So, you know, there's a proposed mechanism for blister prevention in a moisture management sense. And with the PTFE or Engo patches, we have a bit of coefficient of friction research in dry and moist conditions. But again, even like I rely heavily on Engo patches and gel toe protectors at the ultra marathons I go to. Neither of them have any evidence for them. Further to that, now that we know that bone movement is fundamental for producing the shear that causes blisters, there is nothing in a biomechanical sense that has been put to the test as a blister prevention mechanism. So if we want to be evidence-based practitioners, which we all do, it would be very hard to really do much of any use here. And that makes it difficult if you're just making a start in terms of upping your blister prevention game. You know, a lot of these things that I rely on, you wouldn't even try because there's no evidence. So to overcome that, I'm going to propose that this chart, which you may have seen before, I published it with Doug Ritchie in the paper in January 2024. It is possible to take a structured approach to blister prevention if you understand what shear is, why it happens, and how to minimize it. Forget about heat, moisture, and friction. Focus on repetitive shear deformation. Why do we get it, and how can we minimize it? And this is the chart. So every blister I have in front of me, I look at this chart and I think, what can I do here? I'm going to walk through each of these mechanisms, and what I want you to do is just keep an eye out for these two, because these two are completely missed or misunderstood. All right, so let's go through each of these. Now, we can impact on the number of shear repetitions. So basically this means don't play as long, don't run as far, don't walk as far. Bit of a cop-out. I de-emphasize this, but, you know, it is theoretically a blister prevention strategy. We can do things to increase the skin's resilience to shear. And this is kind of taking part in our training regime without us really knowing it. When we undergo training, we are increasing the loads on our cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems and getting them ready for this event that we're about to partake in. And what most people don't realize is you're also training your skin. So as long as you don't really make any rookie errors like do the training, don't just get off the couch and run 10Ks after 6 months of no running, and don't pull a new pair of shoes out of the box and wear them on race day, then as long as you've got the training regime and you're following that to a T, it's kind of taking care of the adaptations that occur when the skin is subjected to shear load incrementally. And the vast number of preventions act to reduce the magnitude of shear deformation. So they're trying to reduce that magnitude, trying to make that smaller. How can we do that? First of all, we can influence bone movement. Now, we know that bone movement is a fundamental factor contributing to shear. So if we think that that bone is moving too much, or we think that we can impact on that bone movement, we can reduce the magnitude of shear deformation. Now, as podiatrists, we are experts at this. It could be orthotics, it could be footwear recommendations, it could be calf stretches, all sorts of things that influence the biomechanics, which is the bone movement. It could even be gait retraining. We can use adhesive materials to spread shear load. This is where taping lives. Taping works not by stopping rubbing. Rubbing's not the problem, and in fact, rubbing is often the solution. Taping, instead of shear being very pinpoint, it spreads it over a larger surface area, okay? And thereby reducing peak shear at that bony prominence. So it's a little bit like cushioning. If you implement a cushioned insole, it reduces pressure just by spreading it out over a larger area, rather than that peak pressure being so pinpoint. We can use materials that absorb shear. So an example of this would be gel toe sleeves. The gel undergoes shear, so does Spenco insoles, and so do thick cushioned socks. They undergo a little bit of shear, which means there's going to be less shear that needs to happen in the skin. And finally, we can do things to reduce friction force. And there's two ways to do this, because we know friction equals the coefficient of friction times the normal force. So basically pressure and coefficient of friction. Pressure, we're experts at this. I don't really need to go into this other than to say deflective padding, orthotics, or, you know, biomechanical interventions can reduce peak pressures. And the coefficient of friction is one I don't think we really understand what we're doing when we are implementing this, or what strategies actually provide this. An example would be moisture wicking socks. So any moisture management strategy is looking to get drier skin, because we know dry skin has a lower coefficient of friction than moist skin. So moisture wicking socks, changing your socks twice a day, airing your shoes out at the end of the day, that kind of thing. Powders can be used to affect drier skin, theoretically. I'll let you decide whether you think any sock, including moisture wicking socks, keep the skin the kind of bone dry that's needed for very low friction, because really the smallest amount of sweat and it ticks over into moist skin, and moist skin is tacky and sticky, which means larger shear deformation. But other mechanisms that work here would be lubricants. So lubricants, we put it on the skin. We're looking for slippage between the skin and the sock. We can put an Ango patch on the shoe, so we're getting slippage between the shoe and the sock. We can use double socks. So the idea here is we are purposefully choosing sock materials that we know are slipperier, more slippery than grippy, compared to the sock skin interface and the sock shoe interface. So these are all the things that can reduce the coefficient of friction. And just looking at coefficient of friction a little bit closer, There's two measurements for coefficient of friction. One is static and one is kinetic or dynamic. When we think of rubbing, we think of this jagged line here, this kinetic friction area. And we probably don't even think about the fact that there's this static friction part, first of all. So it's like every rubbing episode, you have no rubbing, rubbing, no rubbing, rubbing, no slip, slip, no slip, slip. And if you can see that, if knowing that coefficient of friction is a proxy for the magnitude of shear deformation, shear peaks in a state of static friction. So the static coefficient of friction determines how high these shear magnitudes are. And the way we get blister prevention by reducing the coefficient of friction is we need to get rubbing sooner. If we can get rubbing sooner with this orange line here, you can see that the coefficient of friction, the static coefficient of friction, has peaked at a lower rate, at a lower level, because we've got rubbing much sooner in each shear episode. So we get the bone movement and the skin is able to move sooner in sync with that bone. That's what reducing the coefficient of friction means. So if we look back at this, we've established that taping doesn't do anything about rubbing. It just spreads shear load over a larger area. And not only that, not only is rubbing not the problem, anything that does this, including pressure and coefficient of friction, anything on this corner of the chart is looking to get rubbing sooner. So if we do this again, if you press really hard, you'll get big shear magnitudes. We're looking at pressure here. If you press really soft, you'll find that, you know, before shear can build to any degree, your fingertip slides across the back of your hand and we're into the kinetic friction. So just by reducing pressure, we've reduced friction force. In the same way, if I put a blob of Vaseline there and I press really hard, what you wouldn't see are these big shear deformations. It would look like this. It would look like I'm hardly pressing because we've made it slippery. We've reduced the coefficient of friction. So this is how we can reduce the magnitude of shear deformation. And I don't think as podiatrists we quite get that that's what we're doing when we are suggesting lubricants, moisture wicking socks, Engo patches, any of those sorts of things. But yeah, that's what we're doing. Now, what I want to do is apply that chart to a specific blister location. So we're going to assume that we've got blisters under the first MPJ and we are seeing a plantar flex first ray. So let's go through these again. Let's assume we can't do anything about the repetitions and we've maximized the skin's resilience to shear. We've made no rookie errors there. What can we do to reduce the magnitude of shear deformation? Well, as podiatrists, we probably go straight here and do taping. Yes, you can do taping. Just don't have an overinflated expectation as to how effective that can be. Me, 20 years ago, I thought that's all I needed to do until I soon found out I need to do much more than that for my own blisters. So yes, by all means do that. You'll get a little bit of shear reduction. That might be enough for some people, but just understand there's people out there where that's not enough. Second of all, we could implement a Spenco insole. If the insole from the shoe is a bit bottomed out or worn and not particularly cushioning to start with, you could replace the insole of the shoe with a Spenco, 3mm Spenco insole. You could put a Spenco cover on your orthotic. You could even suggest that they wear thick, densely padded socks. We could suggest that they use a lubricant or put an Engo patch on the insole under that first MPJ. Don't do lubricants over the whole foot. It's important to realize that friction actually isn't a bad thing. It's kind of a good thing. And that's because we need friction for traction and our foot needs a bit of traction in the shoe. So when we're trying to affect reduced friction, we're just trying to do it at the specific anatomical location where it's required. And unfortunately, when people apply lubricants, they whack it over the whole foot and everything's a bit too slippery slidey. Plus you need to reapply it after an hour and a half because it disperses into the sock. So Engo patch or a lubricant. And then we've still got to do reduce pressure and reduce bone movement. So let's say that this plantar flex first ray is a rigid plantar flex first ray or a stiff plantar flex first ray. Pressure is one of the big issues here. So what we've got to do is think like a podiatrist and do whatever we do to reduce pressure under the first MPJ when we've got a plantar flex first ray when it's rigid. You might do some deflective padding 2 to 5. You might do an orthotic that gets more midfoot contouring to offload the forefoot, any of those kinds of things. On the other hand, let's say we were dealing with a flexible or compliant plantar flex first ray. And so as the forefoot bears weight, the arch flattens. So we end up with basically a functional hallux limitus. So the arch flattens, and what you're really seeing there is the bone is moving relative to the skin. Having a flexible flat foot, we can do things to reduce that arch flattening. So it could be an orthotic. It could be calf stretches if you think that the forefoot is loading too soon because we've got limited ankle joint dorsiflexion. It could be a footwear recommendation. It could be a heel lift. It could be cluffy wedge or under the big toe to get a bit of dorsiflexion. Any of those things that you would normally do to facilitate the windlass mechanism. You might even do a first ray cutout or a first ray wipe on your orthotic. So that's basically how I approach every blister that I ever see. I see this in the back of my mind and I think, what are all the things that I can do? Now, to pick the right one, because there's many of these that you could do, you can pick one, you can pick multiple. To do that, you kind of really need to know how all the preventions work. So you need to know their mechanism of action, their pros and cons, and where on the foot they work best, and obviously their evidence base and any lab research that there might be. That will help you understand what to prioritize or to put them in a hierarchy. Yeah, I mean, that's like that's more than a half-hour conversation. But essentially, we do have Blister Prevention University. So Doug and I put this together while we were waiting for our papers to be published. And it essentially goes through all of these things that you need to know. So if it feels a bit overwhelming, we've got all the prevention strategies here and we outline how they work, pros and cons. Really important to know that, because there's no one strategy that works best in every location, in every situation. Not only that, we've got all the anatomical locations where we can get blisters. If you really want to get success with blister management, you've got to not start with the question, what's the best blister prevention, or what's the best blister prevention in running? It's what's the best blister prevention for this anatomical site? And then you can start nuancing it to the sport or the activity and the specifics of the individual in front of you. Start with the anatomical location, because I don't care whether you're a boxer or a ballerina, the best prevention for a pinch callus on the little toe is the same regardless. There might be reasons that you might not go for the best, but you'll go for the second best. And that's when you start at the top and then you nuance it for the specifics of the footwear and that kind of thing. So Blister Prevention University, I can obviously highly recommend, because I made it with Doug's help, but it's very good because, as I said, it's easy to become paralyzed if you just want to be an evidence-based practitioner. We don't have the evidence base, but we've tried to be as helpful as we can with this. And all of these, we go through sort of orthotic prescription variables as well as, the actual prevention. Like we go into the detail for lubricants and ango patches and gel toe sleeves, etc. Because it's not just implement an orthotic. You've got to know what design features we need in that orthotic for that anatomical location. Again, this is not anything really that special. It's just getting you to think like a podiatrist. Just imagine you're dealing with a bone injury or a soft tissue injury, not just a skin injury. People sort of think that they've got to do different things for skin injuries, but when there's a biomechanical cause underlying it, which there is, shear, the biomechanics is important. Blister Prevention University, you can find it here under courses at our pro site. This is a site that's separate to our consumer site that is mainly aimed at podiatrists and other health professionals. So that's that. Now, we got one question, and feel free to type questions in the chat box, or you can just pop your mic on because this won't take long. Darren sent in a question, soccer boots and recurring blisters in children. It's really not a specific enough question. I can't answer it, Darren, because I don't know whether you're talking about a posterior heel blister, a subungual blister, or a pinch blister of the little toe. So feel free to get back in touch. Let me know exactly where we're talking about. My guess is it is a posterior heel blister, common in soccer. And my best recommendation for that, no matter what the activity, is Engo patches. Now, soccer boots in kids, especially those ones that are kind of don't have laces and they're all elastic up the top, it's a bit tricky because when you're using Engo patches on the back of the heel, you've got to be careful when you put your foot into the shoe that you don't just, your sock doesn't catch the top of that patch and drag it down, because the patch won't last as long as it should. It should last, well, a whole soccer season, put it that way. But, you know, if you're dealing with a runner, it's around 500 Ks. So a little bit tricky with kids. They're not particularly compliant with that sort of thing, and any shoe that doesn't have laces. So there are definitely limitations there. But that would be the top line. So that's that, guys. Any questions?
Rebecca, I did have one question, if that's all right.
Go for it.
I had an ultra marathon runner who's a lady come in the other day, and she had her second toe on the tip of her toe. She had a blister like right at the apex, and it lifted up the nail came away.
Yep.
She's got a slightly longer second toe, but her shoes were like good length. They weren't too small. But she was wearing an Injinji liner sock, and then she had another acrylic sock over the top of it.
Yep.
And it was a very thin liner sock. And I was wondering whether it would just be better for her to wear just a thicker, sort of more regular Injinji sock rather than wearing the two, like a thinner and just a thicker normal sock.
A little bit hard to say, but I will say this. Blisters that involve the end of the toe or the under the toenail are either caused by that happening or that happening.
Yeah, I think it was the clawing. She had a slight clawing of the toe. She's used like silicone toe caps. She's tried an Ottoform before under the toe, and potentially I just didn't make it comfortable enough for her to tolerate it when she was running. But so it could be clawing. It
can be. Yeah, it's a bit of trial and error. Here's what I would recommend. You can have the perfect size shoe, but if the runner has their laces too loose, the toes are in the end of the toe box. So we've got to take that out of the equation, or figure out whether that's happening. So first things first, take the insole out, have a look at where the toes are sitting on the insole, because that'll tell you whether, okay, this shoe is the perfect size, but you're wearing it too loose, and you might as well be wearing a shoe that's 3 sizes too small as far as that toe is concerned. So that's easy to deal with. Shoes are the right size, and then lacing. So the lacing is critical there. Did you say she's an ultra runner?
Yeah, yep.
How many days are her races, or is it 1 day?
She did a backyard ultra recently, and it was 80 or 90 Ks worth. So it was like 6 kilometre laps, and they do one every hour.
Oh, okay.
It was quite stop and start, but it was like 90 Ks over the course of the day.
Yeah, so I find that if it's over several days, if you have a hot day, they'll loosen their laces because their feet are swollen.
Okay.
And that's when this happens. Yeah. So they've got to be 100% aware of what's going on there. It's still not any good to have loose laces. And then if it is the digital clawing, then the shoe size is irrelevant. Okay. It's all about reducing that digital clawing. And I recommend, what I tell people is, go to the podiatrist, get an Ottoform K made, go and get some felt and start experimenting with what kind of bulk that you need under there. The good thing about felt is it's completely adjustable, and they can do that in the field, like during the race type of thing, or in their training. they can be like, oh no, that's not quite enough, and they'll put another layer on and another layer, and then, oh, that's too much. And then you can even take that information to the podiatrist, and they can sort of think, okay, I've got to have the Otiform K this bulky. And it helps us, it gives us information as to exactly what's going to be successful here. But even then, Otiform Ks is difficult to make in exactly the same one, you know, one day apart from another. So it's subject to error. And I also suggest get something off the shelf. So I sell little toe props here. You can get usually the silicone ones at the chemist. You might get lucky and that is the perfect fit and does everything you need. Again, if anything, you have that information to take that to the podiatrist who's going to make your Otiform K prop, and you'll say, no, this one's too bulky, or I didn't like this, and that gives you information as to how to make that Otiform K. Yeah. So it's all about stopping that clawing, and it's all about toe props. So whether it's felt and they're in complete control, something off the shelf, you might get lucky. Otiform K, we have some control over that, but it's a little bit of trial and error. So we've got to start experimenting with that well before the event.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Welcome. Any other questions, Sylvia?
No, all good for me. Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca.
No worries. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining me today. I won't have an episode of Office Hours next month. I'll be speaking at a conference. So you'll catch me. That'll be October, that means. Any questions in the meantime, hit me up. Any topics you want me to cover, hit me up. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.